We can have it on our YouTube playlist for later. My name's Chelsea Cohen, by the way. I am instructor at Laney College in Oakland and a part of the Peralta Online Equity team. We're so glad to have you here today. A couple more housekeeping items. Just keep your mics on mute throughout the presentation. Use the chat if you'd like to ask questions. We may have time for Q&A at the end. And also closed caption features enabled so you can activate it by clicking show captions or CC live transcript in the bottom toolbar. And with that, I would like to now introduce our presenter, Kara Stanley from San Jose State University. And her presentation is Designing for Dignity: How Trauma-Informed Instructional Design Advances Equity in Online Learning. Okay, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Kara.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And let's see. Oh, that's wrong one. Don't you love it when you do that? I have multiple screens and it's always fun to get that to go to the right one. All right. There we go. Are you seeing my slides now? Okay, perfect. So as we just mentioned, we're going to talk about designing for dignity and look into how trauma-informed instructional design can benefit us in the field of online learning equity. So my name is Kara Stanley. I go by she, they pronouns. My name is pronounced Kara. Real simple. I am an instructional designer for San Jose State University. I have been in higher ed for almost 20 years now, actually 20 years this year. I specialize in accessibility and trauma-informed instructional design. I also teach STEM. My first two degrees were in agriculture and plant, soil, and environmental science. So I kind of started there and then skidded sideways right into instructional design. And I've been there ever since. You can reach out to me if you would like to. It is my name, kara.stanley@sjsu.edu. You can also find me on the Center for Faculty Excellence and Teaching Innovation portion of the SJSU on website. So before we can really talk about trauma and equity, we first have to talk about what is trauma. So you'll see varying definitions. You have the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration definition. This is the American Psychology Association definition. I kind of like this one a little better. I think it more holistically covers what trauma actually is. A lot of times when we think about trauma, we think about what everyone thinks about. We think about post-traumatic stress disorder. We think about big events and big incidents. And that isn't exactly what trauma is. It is any disturbing experience that can result in fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or disruptive feelings. And it's anything that can have long-lasting negative effects on your attitude, your behavior, your cognitive functioning, other aspects of functioning. And we really have to think about trauma as being this sum total of the experience. And it comes into play through 3 E's. So we have events. That is the perceived or real harm or danger a person experiences. Now, the key word with this is perceived. It is how that person perceives that event as being harmful. And this can happen in childhood. We call those adverse childhood experiences. So I know there's a lot of things that I experienced as a child that would not probably phase me today as an adult, but that really kind of impacted me at the time. So that could have been an adverse childhood experience depending on how I experienced it. So, and there are differing levels even for adults. What is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. And it's the experience, like I said, how we interpret and are impacted by the event. Um, I like to use the tornado description for this. I live in Oklahoma. Tornadoes are a yearly occurrence for us. Our response to a tornado is to go out on the porch and see if we can film it. Recently, there was a big tornado that went through Enid. It clipped the Air Force Base up there, and you've got videos of people just standing outside videoing it. And it's close enough you can hear the sound of the tornado. It is not far away. And they're just like, yeah. Now, if somebody comes from Connecticut or California or Oregon or overseas, Korea, and they come here and they're in Oklahoma and we have a tornado, that is a traumatic experience for them, where it is not a traumatic experience for a native Oklahoman. It's just life as we know it. And that's trauma. What could be traumatic for one person is not traumatic for someone else. And then the effect is the long-lasting negative impact of the trauma. It could be immediate. I lost my house in the tornado. That is an immediate traumatic event. It could be chronic. I was in my house when I lost it to the tornado, and now every time we have a storm, it freaks me out. That is a chronic. It could be delayed. I've been fine right up until we had another tornado warning in my area, and all of a sudden, I'm having a panic attack. We've had other storms, but they weren't tornado warned storms. I wasn't worried about them. So those are how we understand trauma. And it is very, very individual. It varies from person to person. And then that brings us into how trauma-informed design intersects equity. So there are some aspects of different types of trauma that are more likely to kind of come in and play into this equity piece. So systemic inequality can be trauma. We can carry generational trauma from the negative experiences of previous generations. This could be racial trauma. This could be gendered trauma. This could be trauma around gender identity, sexual preferences. Those are points of trauma that we can carry with us through generations. We can also carry trauma based around what we call insidious trauma. Being told you're female, so you're not going to be good at STEM could be a point of insidious trauma. These are things that we can carry. This is systemic equity. So those are points that can come in where we have an inequity in the system and it becomes traumatic for the people who experience it. There is a disproportionate impact of trauma on minority and marginalized groups and individuals. So minority groups and marginalized groups are more likely to experience trauma than are non-minority groups. That's just kind of the way things happen. It's like environmental justice. Minority and marginalized groups are more likely to suffer from environmental pollution than your less marginalized and more affluent, often, individuals and communities. And we see this a lot in Oklahoma. Uh, a lot of our major environmental problems are in small, rural, poor communities that often have a very high indigenous population. So trauma is the same way. There is a disproportionate impact. And then there's behavioral misinterpretation. And this is a big one. And this is an area that we have to kind of reframe everything as we think about it, especially in online learning, because there are behaviors and there are indications of trauma that we as instructors may not read as being indications of trauma. So ways that people react to trauma can be misinterpreted as being character faults. And so that can present a point of inequity because these are not people that are behaving in this manner because they're just not committed to their education or whatever, whatever fault it may appear to be. They are students who need support. And then if we are misinterpreting behavior, we are not providing that support or pointing students to that support. So this is a quote from a talk that was given to Boston College by Resmaa Menakem. And it really struck me when I heard this quote because it made me stop and think about how I interact with my students and how I interpret the behaviors and the patterns that I was seeing with my students online. That trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality, and trauma decontextualized in a people looks like culture. If I take that response to trauma, if I take that trauma and that response to it, and I take it out of context, especially in an online learning environment, it might look like personality faults rather than, response to trauma. And so that made me stop and reevaluate how I was doing things, how I was responding to students being late on assignments or, various things. So right now, I want to take a moment, pause for a second, and I want you to think about how trauma could manifest in an online course. And I want you to put it in the chat. What do you think a manifestation of trauma in an online course might look like? What behaviors or patterns? Missing assignments? Yep. Trouble getting started? Inability to meet deadlines? Unsure where to go and what to do, being, kind of difficulty with executive function. That's a good one. Not logging in for days or weeks. Yep, missing weeks. Hard time engaging with other classmates. Yeah, and with EMTs and CNAs, there's a lot of trauma and compassion fatigue that can represent trauma in there. Not responding to emails, fear of reaching out for help. Yep, those are all extremely accurate ways that trauma can, come to play in our classes. So they may have existing unusual behaviors. Their discussions, their emails, their messages may be inappropriate in content or inappropriate in tone. They may be aggressive or short-tempered. They may be snappish. And this may be something that comes with them into the class. So we don't ever see a different behavior from them. Their quality of work may change abruptly. They may be a great student and all of a sudden we're getting a assignment that they left the AI prompt in. And I've had that happen in classes. They were doing great. And all of a sudden I get an assignment and they left the prompt that they plugged into AI in that assignment. And I'm like, okay, what changed? My first reaction, was kind of to be annoyed, but then stop and think, what changed? Why is this change happening? They suddenly begin turning in work late. if they stop responding to email messages or discussions, if they were communicating appropriately and now suddenly are not communicating appropriately. And like I said, the sudden clear use of AI to create assignment content. Other things that may come into play, just academic behaviors, failing to turn in work, never responding to emails, not participating in discussions. They may be turning in every other assignment, they're just not participating in discussions. That could be a sign of some trauma hiding there. If their work quality just is kind of lacking, they're just not quite making it all the way to the top of the rubric. And then assignments may be late from the beginning of course. If they're coming in with trauma, if they're coming in with something happening in their life that is traumatic, then it may be just something that happens. And historically, we may have just passed that off as, well, they're bad at time management, they're not committed, blah, blah, blah. They're just out of high school, they're not doing, they're having a hard time adjusting. And it could be some of that, but it could also be trauma that could be coming into play. So when we talk about the impact of trauma on how people learn, it is a case of Maslow before Bloom. And yeah, there are issues with Maslow's whole theory and setup, but the base thought here is that trauma is a response to an overwhelming experience, not a student deficit. I came very close to dying in college. That was a traumatic experience. I did not perform particularly well in that semester. I should have talked to my professors about it. I didn't. I didn't think they'd care. So I didn't talk to them about it. And I got my butt chewed at the end of that semester for not telling them what was going on. But I didn't do well in that semester. I was quite literally fighting for my life. I wasn't worried about turning in a paper. So it is a response to an overwhelming experience, not a student deficit. It wasn't that I didn't want to do well. It was that I was so focused on survival that it just wasn't happening. Trauma is going to prioritize survival, and that can halt our higher level cognition. So, and that's not just physical trauma, that's, that could be losing a job, that could be the ending of a major relationship, that could be a death in the family. There are things that can provide that trauma, financial stress, that, they haven't lost the job, but they are having a hard time making ends meet. They're going to be more concerned with keeping the lights on and keeping a roof over their head than they are going to be with turning in that quiz. And that's just the way it happens. Trauma impairs attention, concentration, memory, critical thinking, problem solving. Our brains don't work as well when they're overloaded. We know that. We talk about cognitive overload, but trauma can create cognitive overload because the brain is just focusing in on what's causing the trauma or the response to the trauma. And if you think about all of the chemicals that get dumped in our brain, the cortisol, the adrenaline, all of those things that dump when we are in a traumatic, anxiety-inducing experience, when that's happening, that just immediately puts you into fight or flight. And the cognitive level, again, your ability to access the higher order thinking skills we need for a course is usually going to come down. It's just harder for us to access. So what is trauma-informed instructional design? We talk about trauma-informed pedagogy a lot. So we talk about, how do I teach in a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive manner? But what is that for instructional design? It's a different thing. Trauma-informed instructional design are things that I can set up in my class. And I set them up and then they're just there. That's, contact options, other things like that. So it's an instructional design approach that curates learning experience to reduce cognitive and emotional barriers. We're not just talking about avoiding re-traumatization. So, if we are in a class where we're going to be talking about topics that could re-traumatize, if we're in a counseling program and we're going to have to talk about how you deal with abuse survivors, how you interface with abuse survivors, that is a potentially re-traumatizing topic. And we need to be aware of that and, make sure that our students are aware that this is coming. And we need to design support into that class for that re-traumatizing topic. It's not just about handling it sensitively. Instructional design comes in and says, how can I design support into my class for this? How can I design, ways that students can contact me? How can I design access to student supports within my class that makes them readily available? It fosters safety, empowerment, and accessibility for learners who have experienced trauma. So we don't know what somebody's going through on the other side of the computer. So if I can look at my course and go, okay, I've got these high stress, high stakes areas in my course, how can I redesign that so that we're not having so much stress, so much anxiety? Can I take that big exam and turn it into a practical problem-based project that maybe we can work up to reduce that exam stress? Can I do this in that class? So I look at what I'm doing and I look at how I can foster that kind of safety and empowerment and accessibility for those students. I want to prioritize my students' psychological safety and flexibility in my design. Everywhere that I can prioritize flexibility, I want to prioritize flexibility. Can I be flexible on due dates? Can I give a grace period? Can I give multiple ways that they can complete an assignment? If I want them to do a video, what other ways could I give them that would show the same mastery of that? What other ways could I give them? Maybe somebody who's got their trauma makes them unwilling to appear on camera. It makes them self-conscious about appearing on camera. They could have scars that they don't want to appear on camera. How can I give them other ways to complete that would function without, traumatizing them or asking them to traumatize themselves? And we're trying to just ensure that the content doesn't trigger a stress response. If we can make content that doesn't trigger stress responses, we can hopefully enhance engagement and their academic success. A big point for a lot of my STEM students are tests. I have so many students that are terrified of testing because they have been told their whole life that they're not good at STEM. They're not good at science. I had one student just straight up tell me, I'm too dumb to do science. And I'm like, no, you're not. But that got me thinking, how can I ensure that my content is not triggering that stress response? So we do an entire course project. And they have to write a mock journal article and present it at a mock conference. And so, we got away from the big high stakes exams and went with something a little more practical. So what is our foundation that we're building from here when we talk about trauma-informed principles or trauma-informed pedagogy or trauma-informed instructional design? There are 6 core principles. It is grounded in these 6 core principles, and these are the principles of trauma-informed practice. And SAMHSA, SAMHSA, stands for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The 6 principles are safety, both physical and emotional, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. So when we talked about being able to carry generational trauma, that is significant enough that it gets its own principle. So that is a significant enough source of trauma. It gets its own principle in there that we need to be aware of it. And there are areas in our course where we can kind of bring each of these things in and kind of prioritize them. Obviously, online learning, I can't do much about their physical safety, but I can steward their emotional safety. I can build a culture of trustworthiness and transparency by starting with my own communication. I can build areas for peer support in. I can give them ways to connect with their peers. I can give them tutoring resources. I can make myself available through multiple means of communication. Collaboration and mutuality. Again, I can do peer reviews. I can, give them the opportunity to help me build our communications policy for that course, or to help me look at rubrics for the course. I can give them some say in how that course is running. Empowerment, voice, and choice. I can give them power over their learning journey, give them choices. You can do this or this or this. Here's a list of topics you can pick from, or if you have one you want to do, you can email me and get it approved. I can give them that control over their learning journey. And then the cultural, historical, and gender issues, this comes in with being sure that all of my materials are appropriate, that I am acknowledging any issues in my topic area in the design of my course. Science, biology has a lot of those. We've done some pretty shady stuff in the past, and we have to acknowledge that we've done shady stuff in the past. If we do not acknowledge that we've done shady stuff in the past and we've silenced a lot of voices, and we are currently silencing a lot of voices and doing a lot of shady stuff, then we can't address that trauma. We cannot build a place where it's safe to address that trauma. We have to acknowledge those things. So I want to stop and kind of, as we kind of wrap up the last of my deal here, and I'm going to go through, we're going to talk about actionable strategies. And so I'm going to give you an area, and I want you to think about what would that area mean in your course? And I want you to kind of post in the chat what maybe some actionable strategies you can think of just off the top of your head might be for your course. And I'll talk about my courses and some courses that I've helped design. So we're going to start with safety and predictability. Okay, so we're talking about creating that environment of safety. And so I'm going to give you some points here that are just kind of guiding points, and they're very broad topics. Intentional and regular design, course alignment, and clear communication. So think about what are some areas in a course you teach, or a course that you have seen, or a course that you have taken that maybe could be restructured from the design, not the teaching side, but the design side, to kind of incorporate this. Structured schedule, consistent weekly activities. So I do, in my design for my biology courses, we have a very regular schedule. If you open module 1, it's going to look very similar to module 2, module 14. It's going to be pretty similar across the entire course. And I do that so that my students, if they get an idea of what they're going to have to put into 1 week, that will carry forward. They know about what they're going to see. Yep, discussion boards being open 24/7. Another piece with this is when you talk about quizzes and those sorts of things, open them for the whole week, even if you don't want to have them just open all the time, the entire course. Give them a substantial length of time to be able to do that, because I have students, they may only be available on the weekend. That may be their only time to get a lot of stuff done. If I don't give them a weekend to do it, I may be cutting their ability, and that's going to be a point of stress and trauma in that course. Multiple attempts on quizzes. Yeah, I like to give at least 2 attempts on quizzes, because, if I'm going to have a quiz, I want it to show to be a little bit more low stress. Clear communication, that's our syllabus. That's our scaffolding in our assignments. Be sure that your assignments are clear about what you want students to do. And if you didn't make something clear, don't assess them on it. I'm sure we've all had instructors where we got in there and they're like, I really don't have any idea what I'm doing. And you do your best and you get the grade back and you're like, that wasn't mentioned anywhere. Where the heck was that? Don't do that to your students. That's a trauma point right there. And then alignment. If I can show my students, this is the course outcome, this is the module outcome, this is the assignment, these are the materials, and it all lines up, and I can show them that map all the way down. Even better if I can show them where they can use that in their job or their life. I add skills outcomes to most of my modules, saying, here's what you're going to learn. Here's how it will benefit you in real life. You're going to be able to talk to your doctor better because you're going to understand biology. So voice, choice, and empowerment. This is our next actionable strategy area. It's talking about flexible assessments, choice of materials, and student involvement. How could you put that into a course? How could you design that into a course? What are areas that you could bring this in? So my biology class, I have the book and I have video options for every concept that we're going to actually use in that particular module. So if it's covered in the book, I have a video version of that information. And the reason for doing that is some students like to read, some students would rather cut off their pinky than read a book. They just don't like it. They'd rather listen to a video, or they don't have time to read. They're listening to the video as they're doing dishes, as they're driving. So those are areas that, I will throw that in there so that they have that choice. And I let them know you can read, you can watch the videos. You can read, then watch whatever you didn't understand. It's up to you how you want to do that. Multiple means of submission. Yeah. We also, for the conference presentation, they do, basically they can do a conference presentation where they've recorded it in Zoom or in PowerPoint. They can give me a full storyboard if they don't have a way to record. They can give me an audio file and a slide deck. We have different ways that we can go about doing that so that no matter what their level of comfort is or their level of access, because we're in rural Oklahoma, not everybody has broadband, they have a way that they can then submit that. So promoting inclusivity, that's another one. And this is a bad word in Oklahoma right now. We're not supposed to talk about inclusivity in Oklahoma right now. Luckily, I don't work for an Oklahoma institution right now. I'm here for San Jose State. Um, so this comes into thinking about culture and how can we be inclusive from the accessibility standpoint? How can we be inclusive from the cultural standpoint? How can we include all of the students, preferably that we can possibly reach? How can we get them included and represented in the course? So we're getting into culturally fair assessments, the use of OER, addressing systemic inequities. So that broadband issue is a systemic inequity. Not everyone has the same access. I like to use OER in my biology class. I'm lucky that there are some really good ones available. I took the best bits from all the ones I like to use and I checked them together and made my own OER and I provide that to my students. And about once a year, they try and get me to adopt a paid textbook. And I'm like, oh, heck no, I am not adopting a paid textbook. This one's working just fine. Because we have a lot of poverty in our area and students don't have the money. Their scholarship may not cover it. Their financial aid may not cover it. They may not have the money to buy that textbook. So no, I'm going to cling on to my OER, until they pry it from my cold, dead hands, basically, because I'm just not letting go of that. That's not the best thing for my students. Using diverse images, voices, and success stories. Yes. Try to model your student population and the diversity that is almost always present in our colleges. We have a lot of Native Americans here in Oklahoma. There are a lot of Hispanics at San Jose State. And just a very widely diverse population. Even, small town Oklahoma, we have a very diverse population. We have students coming from out of country or used to come from out of country to play softball at this and baseball at this silly little rural institution because we have a really good team and we have a really good coach. And so people would come from all over the world. We've had people from Japan, we've had people from South America, we've had people from Africa coming to play sports at this college. So we have a very diverse population. Um, and I love that idea to have students submit images and stories and things that they think connect to the topic. I have an interesting things discussion in my biology class, and I ask them to submit interesting research that they may have seen or news articles or those sorts of things. And then some, if they just want to submit pictures that they thought were cool that they've taken that tie to our class. So expanding that to ask them to submit images and stories and other things, that could maybe then expand our cultural relevance or our inclusivity. And now also, like I said, culturally fair assessments. One of the things I did in my course is I went through all of my syllabi and I removed any reference to good language, good use of English, good use of the English language. Anything like that came of my out of my rubrics. The reason being, I have a lot of non-English first, their English is not their first language. They're from out of country. And to put in there that they had a good use of the English language, one is not culturally fair to students that are coming in. It's also not culturally fair to my students that came from more poverty-stricken backgrounds because they may not have had the same educational start that my students from more affluent school districts had. So they may be coming in at a loss. And that's not their fault. That, is just unfortunately the way our school system works here in Oklahoma. We don't pay our school teachers well. And in poverty prone areas, we really don't pay our school teachers well. So, there is unfortunately a correlation between that and, having students coming into our colleges that are not equally prepared across the board. So I went in and removed all of that because I wanted my rubrics to be culturally fair. And I care more about them demonstrating mastery of the scientific concept and communicating utilizing scientific terminology than I care about them using good English. You know, so I'm not an English teacher, I'm a biology professor. That's kind of where I came back around to that. Um, so, and then there were other things that have come up in that area to make sure that I'm not assessing students on things that they may or may not have been able to encounter. So a good one that's not directly biology related, but that came up was somebody mentioned a prompt that revolved around memories of going to Disney. That is not a culturally fair prompt. If someone is not from the US, they may never have been to Disney. Someone may not have been able to afford to go to Disney. Someone may have went to Disney when they were too young to remember it. You cannot utilize something that is not going to be culturally fair to all of your students in that manner if you are not giving them a frame of reference. So that came up and it's like, okay, last time I went to Disney, I was like 3 years old. I have no memory of that. I never went to Disney after I got older to where I would remember it. We went to Six Flags. So I could draw on that, but I know people that have never been to Six Flags. Their family couldn't afford it. Or they just didn't ever, it wasn't something their parents would have taken them to do. So you have to be aware of the broader frame of reference. If I want to talk about things that specifically happened in the US, I have to make sure that my students have all of the information about those things. I can't assume that they're going to know about it without it being provided, or that they will have had that experience without it, being explained to them. And then tackling institutional culture. This is not specifically an instructional design piece, but it is a piece that we have to think about. Because especially talking about online learning, we don't always provide the same resources to those students at our college that are online learners that we provide to those learners that are face-to-face learners. So what can we do as instructional designers or as faculty designing our courses to help with that? Are there low cost or free online mental health services that I can provide links for and make sure my students know I'm not endorsing this over any other thing. I'm just, here are some low cost links. If you need it, here are places you can find this information. Links to repositories of information. Because, one of my masters was online. I was paying for all of the mental health services, but that college was not offering any sort of hybrid or online mental health service. So I could not access the mental health services because I was out of state. So if I had needed them, I would not have been able to access them. Oklahoma state regents here have provided mental health services through an online provider. So the online students can access it low or no cost. But a lot of places you don't have that. So what do you do with a student who is online and not at that campus to give them those accesses? If they don't have online tutoring, where can a student go if they need to find online tutoring? And how do we foster community? You know, I have a comprehensive list of where to find free Wi-Fi. Here's places you can go to get a low cost or no cost computer. I have a comprehensive social services kind of list that I give to my students because accessing those services can be really difficult for online students in a rural area and not knowing where to go for them. And you can't research it online if you don't have the online part of it. But if I can give them a place where they can, pull it up on their phone and okay, I can go over here and do this, then that makes it easier for them. And that's something I can design in. And this is also places we can push for change at our individual institutions, just to push them for it. So conclusions, we're basically just trying to create a more equitable and effective learning environment. We're trying to foster healing and resilience in our students alongside that academic achievement. And we can't fix the trauma for our students, but we can empower them within our course and help them achieve their academic goals and to an extent their personal goals. All right, any questions for me on this? It is a big subject, a really big subject.
Any questions for Kara? Final comments?
And I know we ran right up to time. If you come up with any questions, feel free to email me. I am always happy to provide resources and answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kara. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. I learned a lot. It looks like folks in the Zoom room did too. And yeah, thank you again for presenting. Thanks all for being here. Our next session's going to start in a little over 10 minutes. So if you want to take a break, feel free to do that, and we'll be back shortly.